Hey, you black boy, come here.
Gerald Thornton snapped his fingers. The entire hall turned. Preston Everett stood motionless. His old coat, the only black person in the room.
You're always hovering around this piano like a fly.
Gerald grabbed Preston's arm and pulled him toward a chair.
Sit down! Play something. Let's see what can black kids do.
The crowd fell silent.
I'm not ready, sir.
Of course not! Play Beethoven. A real composer. Do black kids know who he is?
Preston's hand hovered over the piano keys, trembling. A teacher had just forced a black student to sit at the piano to humiliate him in front of 300 people. But then, that arrogance vanished completely. Philadelphia is a city split in two. On one side, the mainline suburbs, mansions behind iron gates, private tennis courts, streets so clean you could eat off the sidewalk. Kids who get dropped off at school in BMWs. On the other side, West Philadelphia. Row houses stacked tight one after another. Cracked porches, screen doors that never shut right. The smell of fried chicken from the corner store hanging in the air at all hours. A car rolls by at 2 a.m, bass rattling the windows. This is where Preston Everett grew up. He was 15, tall for his age, but skinny, like his body was still figuring itself out. He had his father's hands, long fingers, wide palms, and his grandmother's eyes, deep brown, quiet, the kind that watched everything and gave away nothing. Preston lived with his grandmother, Diane Everett, in a small row house on 54th Street. The porch leaned to one side. The kitchen faucet dripped day and night. Upstairs, Preston's bedroom ceiling had a water stain that, and this is strange, looked exactly like a piano key. Diane raised him alone. She had to, because Preston's father died when Preston was 6 years old. His name was Terence Everett. He was a jazz pianist. Not famous, not rich. But when Terence sat down at a piano in some small club on a Friday night, people stopped talking, stopped drinking, just listened. He played in bars and lounges all over Philadelphia, anywhere with a piano and a crowd that still believed music could change the feeling of a room. People said Terence didn't play with technique. He played with fire. One night in November, driving home from a late gig on Broad Street, Terence ran a red light. They said it was instant. Preston was 6. He didn't understand the word instant. He just knew that his father's chair at the kitchen table stayed empty after that, and the keyboard in the living room went silent. Terence left 2 things behind: a second-hand Casio keyboard with 3 broken keys, and a cardboard box stuffed with sheet music. Chopin, Beethoven, Debussy, Monk, all mixed together, because Terence never believed music needed categories. For a whole year, Preston didn't touch that keyboard. It sat in the corner under a bedsheet, like something no one wanted to look at. Diane never pushed him. She knew grief moves at its own speed. Then one night, when Preston was 7, Diane heard something from the living room. Soft, slow, one note at a time, with long gaps in between. She walked to the doorway and saw her grandson sitting on the floor, the keyboard flat across his lap, pressing keys with one finger. A piece of sheet music was leaning against the wall in front of him. Beethoven's Furelise. He was picking out the notes, one by one, like a child learning to read words for the first time. Diane stood in the doorway and watched. She didn't say a single word. From that night on, Preston taught himself. He studied his father's sheet music the way some kids study comic books, over and over until the pages went soft. He practiced late at night with headphones plugged in, volume low, so the neighbors wouldn't complain. 3 of the keys were dead, so he learned to hear those notes in his head. His fingers pressed down, but no sound came out. He had to imagine it. That strange little workaround did something to his ear. It made it razor sharp. By 10, he could play most of Chopin's nocturnes from memory. By 12, he was working through Beethoven's sonatas, the real ones, not the beginner versions. By 13, he met Louise Calloway. Louise was 81. She lived 3 blocks from Diane's house, in a row house that looked like every other one on the street, except for one detail. Through her front window, if you passed at the right angle, you could see a piano. Old, a little out of tune, but real. Preston met her by accident. Diane had sent him to fix a loose railing on Louise's porch, a quick job for $10. While he worked, he hummed. He didn't even notice he was doing it. The piece was Chopin's Ballade No. 1, not exactly the kind of thing a 13-year-old hums while holding a screwdriver. Louise pushed open her screen door and stared at him. "What was that you were humming?" "I don't know, just something I've been practicing." "That was Chopin." "Yes, ma'am." Louise looked at him for a long time. Then she held the door open. "Come inside. I want to hear you play." That was 2 years ago. Since then, Preston went to Louise's house 3 evenings a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, after school, before dinner. Louise didn't teach him music. He already knew music. She taught him control, how to hold back so the loud parts hit harder, how to breathe between phrases, how to sit with silence and not rush past it. Louise had taught piano for 40 years before arthritis bent her fingers too far to play. But her ear missed nothing, and she did not go easy on him. "Again," she would say, not even looking up. "The left hand is sloppy. Beethoven doesn't forgive sloppy." Preston would nod. Reset. Play it again. One evening, after he played the second movement of the Moonlight Sonata without a single mistake, Louise went quiet. Then she said something Preston never forgot. "Your father played with fire. You play with something rarer. Patience. Beethoven would have understood you." Preston shrugged it off, said he still needed work on the third movement. Louise just looked at him over her glasses and said nothing. She knew he heard her. At school, nobody knew any of this. At Whitfield Academy, Preston was the scholarship kid, one of 4 students on financial aid, the only black kid in his year. He wore the same blazer every day, second-hand, a little too big in the shoulders, because the dress code required one, and Diane could only afford one. He ate lunch alone most days, not because he wanted to, but because every table in that cafeteria had already been claimed by money, and there was no seat saved for him. He took Introduction to Music Theory because he loved music. Gerald Thornton taught that class, and from the first week, Gerald made one thing clear, without ever saying it out loud. Preston did not belong there. But Preston kept his head down, did his homework, never touched a piano at school, never mentioned Louise, the Casio, the hours he spent with Beethoven while other kids played video games. He had one job: keep the scholarship. Don't make trouble. Graduate. Get out. Because if he lost this, if he gave anyone a reason to take it away, he would be back in the public school system, and the one door that had opened for him would close, maybe forever. So he stayed quiet, stayed small, stayed invisible. And nobody, not his classmates, not his teachers, not Gerald Thornton, had any idea what lived inside those hands. Gerald Thornton arrived at Whitfield Academy every morning at exactly 7:45. Silver Audi, cashmere coat, leather briefcase with his initials stamped in gold. He parked in the same spot, front row closest to the entrance, even though it wasn't assigned to him. Nobody ever took it. Nobody dared. He had been the senior music instructor at Whitfield for 22 years. He studied at Juilliard. And if you somehow didn't know that, don't worry, he would tell you. First day of class, every single year. "I trained under the finest musicians in the world," he would say, standing at the front of the room, hands clasped behind his back. This class exists to separate those who appreciate music from those who have no business being near it. His eyes always swept the room when he said that last part, and they always stopped on Preston. Gerald Thornton was not a man who yelled. That was the dangerous thing about him. He never raised his voice. He lowered it, forced you to lean in, made you feel like you had to earn the right to hear what he was saying. He corrected students' posture by tapping their spines with a conductor's baton. Not hard, but firm enough to remind you who was in charge. He graded performances on something he called pedigree of interpretation. Nobody ever asked what that meant. Everyone understood. If your parents donated money to the school, your pedigree was fine. If your last name had been on the honor wall for 2 generations, your pedigree was excellent. If you were Preston Everett, a 15-year-old black kid from West Philly on a scholarship, wearing a second-hand blazer, your pedigree was a problem. Gerald never said it that directly. He didn't have to. He had other ways. In the 3rd week of class, Preston submitted a paper on Beethoven's use of silence in the late string quartets. It was the best paper in the class. Gerald returned it with a C- and 1 note in red ink. Interesting attempt. Perhaps try a topic more within your range. In the 6th week, Gerald asked each student to name their favorite composer. When it reached Preston, he said Chopin. Gerald smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and said, Chopin, really? That's ambitious for someone at your level. The class laughed. Not all of them, but enough. In the 9th week, Gerald was demonstrating a passage from Debussy's Clair de Lune on the classroom piano. He hit a wrong note. A subtle one, but wrong. Preston heard it. His face must have shown something, because Gerald stopped mid-phrase and looked directly at him. Something to add, Mr. Everett? No, sir. Good, because listening is a skill, and some people need more practice at it than others. Preston looked down at his desk. He didn't say another word for the rest of the period. That was Gerald's method. Never a direct attack. Always a small cut. A comment just sharp enough to sting, but too polished to report. Week after week. A slow, steady reminder that Preston was a guest in a house he would never own. And it worked. Not because Preston believed it, but because everyone else started to. The other students stopped sitting next to him. Not out of cruelty, necessarily. More like instinct. Gerald had drawn a circle around the room, and Preston was outside it. Getting close to him meant risking your own position. Headmaster Gregory Ashford knew. He had to know. But Gerald brought in donor money. Gerald's connections filled seats at fundraisers. Gerald's name was on the school's music scholarship, named after himself, of course. Ashford looked the other way. That was easier. There was one teacher who didn't. Nora Sinclair taught English literature. She was younger than most of the staff, early 30s, and she watched the hallways differently. She noticed things, like how Preston always walked on the far side of the corridor when Gerald was nearby, like how Preston's hand would go up in every other class, but never in music theory. One afternoon, Nora passed Preston sitting alone on a bench outside the library. She stopped. You doing okay, Preston? Yes, ma'am. Just reading. She looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded and walked on. She didn't push. But she didn't look away either. Now, Gerald had just announced the spring recital, the biggest night of the school year. Parents in evening wear, donors writing checks, a representative from the Curtis Institute of Music flying in to evaluate students. Gerald stood in front of the class, chest out, voice ringing. This is where we separate real musicians from hobbyists. He looked around the room. His gaze landed on Preston, sitting in the back row. Gerald smiled. Everyone is welcome to attend, of course. even if you're just there to watch. Preston stared at his notebook. His pen didn't move, but his jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. The night of the spring recital, Whitfield Academy looked like a different place. The recital hall had been polished until it glowed. Crystal chandeliers, fresh flowers on every windowsill, 300 chairs arranged in perfect rows, each one filled, parents in suits and evening dresses, donors holding wine glasses by the stem. Headmaster Ashford greeting people at the door with a handshake and a smile that had been rehearsed 100 times. And in the front row, Vivian Holt, Director of Community Outreach at the Curtis Institute of Music. She had flown in from Center City specifically for tonight. A small notebook sat open on her lap, a pen in her hand. She was here to find talent. Backstage, students paced, fingers stretched. Sheet music trembled in sweaty hands. These were kids who had taken private lessons since age 4, who owned their own instruments, who had been groomed for nights exactly like this one. Preston was not backstage. Preston was in the audience. Last row, far left. He came because he wanted to hear the music. That was all. Diane had ironed his only white shirt for the occasion. He wore it tucked into dark pants, no blazer, because his second-hand school blazer had a stain on the sleeve he couldn't get out. He sat with his hands in his lap, still as stone. Gerald Thornton stood at the front of the stage, black suit, silver tie pin. He tapped the microphone once, twice, and smiled at the audience the way a man smiles when he owns the room. Welcome to Whitfield Academy's annual spring recital. Tonight, you will hear the future of classical music. Applause. Warm. Polite. Expectant. The first student performed. Chopin. Solid, not spectacular. Polite applause. The second played Liszt. More confident. Stronger applause. Gerald nodded from the side of the stage like a proud father watching his children shine. Then, between the second and third performance, a music stand near the edge of the stage tipped over. Metal hit hardwood. The sound cracked through the hall like a gunshot. A stagehand rushed over, but Gerald raised his hand, stopped him. Gerald's eyes scanned the audience, slowly, deliberately. And they found exactly who he was looking for. Preston Everett, stand up. 300 heads turned toward the last row. Preston froze. His hands gripped his knees. Come up here and fix this. You're good at picking things up, aren't you? Silence. A few uncomfortable laughs. Preston stood. He walked down the center aisle, the longest walk of his life, picked up the music stand, and set it straight. He turned to leave. Wait. Gerald's voice pinned him to the spot. Since you're already up here, Gerald gestured toward the Steinway grand piano like he was offering a toy to a child. Why don't you play something for us? Preston shook his head slightly. I'm not on the program, sir. I know you're not. Gerald took a step closer, close enough that only the first few rows could hear his next words clearly, but the microphone caught every syllable. Sit down at that piano. Let's see what the scholarship kids are really made of. A mother in the second row covered her mouth. A student backstage peered through the curtain. Nora Sinclair, standing along the side wall, went completely still. Preston didn't move. Gerald leaned into the microphone. Come on, Preston, don't be shy. Play us some Beethoven, a real composer. Unless they don't teach that where you come from. The hall was dead silent. 300 people watching a 15-year-old boy standing alone on a stage he never asked to stand on, under lights he never asked to be under, being asked to prove something he never should have had to prove. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. If you were sitting in that audience, watching a grown man, a teacher, publicly humiliate a 15-year-old kid for no reason other than where he came from and the color of his skin, would you say something? Would you stand up? Or would you sit there, uncomfortable, hoping someone else would do it first? Because 300 people were in that room, 300 adults, and not one of them opened their mouth. Preston looked at the piano. He looked at Gerald. He looked at 300 faces staring back at him. And then he made a decision that nobody in that room was ready for. Preston's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. His legs told him to walk away, walk back down that aisle, sit down, disappear. That was the safe move, the smart move, the move that kept the scholarship, kept the peace, kept him invisible, which was the only thing that had protected him at this school for the past year. But his hands told him something different. His hands remembered the keyboard on the living room floor, the 3 dead keys, the headphones at midnight, the notes he had to imagine because the speakers couldn't play them. His hands remembered Louise Calloway's living room, the old upright piano with the chipped keys, her voice behind him. Again, the left hand is sloppy. And then the rare evenings when she said nothing at all after he played, which meant it was perfect. His hands remembered his father, not his face, that had gone blurry a long time ago, but the sound. The way the house felt different when Terence played, like the walls leaned in to listen. Preston looked at Gerald. Gerald was smiling, relaxed, arms crossed. The smile of a man who had already won, who had set a trap and was now watching it close. And in that smile, Preston saw everything. Every time Gerald marked his paper with a C-, every comment about your level, every sideways glance that told the class Preston was less than, every small, careful cut that left no scar anyone could see, but bled just the same. 300 people were watching, waiting. Most of them expected him to mumble an apology and walk away. Some of them probably wanted that, because it would be easier, cleaner. No one would have to think about what just happened. But Preston thought about something Louise told him once. She said, "There are moments when staying quiet is wisdom. And there are moments when staying quiet is surrender. You'll know the difference when it comes." This was the difference. Preston took a step toward the piano, then another. His shoes were silent on the hardwood stage. He pulled out the bench, sat down, adjusted it 2 inches back, the way Louise taught him. Precise, deliberate. The movement of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The room noticed. Gerald's smile flickered, just for a second, just enough. Preston placed his hands above the keys. He didn't look at Gerald. He didn't look at the audience. He looked at the piano. And he said, quietly, almost to himself, but the acoustics of that hall carried every word. "My father taught me, you answer disrespect with Beethoven." The first note was almost too quiet to hear. Preston's right index finger pressed a single key, G sharp, and the sound drifted into the hall like smoke. Thin, fragile, barely there. A few people in the back row leaned forward, not because they were impressed, because they weren't sure they heard anything at all. Then the second note came, and the third, and the rolling triplet pattern in the left hand, the heartbeat of Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 14, the Moonlight Sonata. But something was wrong. Preston's right hand was trembling. Not dramatically, you wouldn't notice from the back of the room. But in the front row, Vivian Holt saw it. The slight shake in his knuckle, the way his ring finger hesitated a fraction of a second before landing on the key. And she saw something else, too, something most people in the room would miss entirely. The hesitation wasn't lack of skill. It was weight. The weight of playing this piece, his father's favorite, on a stage where he had just been told he didn't belong. Gerald stood at the side of the stage, arms crossed, chin slightly raised. He expected this to last about 30 seconds. A clumsy attempt, a few wrong notes, an embarrassed silence. Then Preston would slink off the stage and Gerald would say something gracious. Well, that was brave, and the evening would continue as planned. That is not what happened. The second phrase began, and the trembling stopped. Preston's left hand found its rhythm, the steady, rolling triplets that Beethoven wrote to sound like waves hitting a shore in the dark. Each note perfectly even, perfectly weighted. The kind of control that doesn't come from talent alone. It comes from years of repetition, in a room where no one is watching. The sound changed. It filled the hall differently than any student performance that night. It had texture. It had gravity. It carried something the audience couldn't name, something older than a 15-year-old had any right to carry. A donor in the fourth row slowly lowered her wine glass to her lap. She didn't drink from it again for the rest of the performance. A student in the second row, a girl who had performed Liszt 20 minutes earlier, leaned forward so far her program slid off her knees and hit the floor. She didn't pick it up. Gerald uncrossed his arms, crossed them again, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His jaw moved slightly, like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. The first movement unfolded like a conversation with someone who wasn't in the room. Preston played it the way Louise taught him, not like a showpiece, but like a confession. The melody in the right hand floated above the rolling bass, like a voice trying to say something it had never been allowed to say. Quiet, aching, patient. A man in the sixth row turned to his wife. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She was already looking at him with the same expression. The expression of someone realizing they are witnessing something that doesn't happen twice. When the final chord of the first movement faded, Preston did not pause. He did not look up. He did not wait for applause. He went straight into the second movement. Allegretto. Faster. Lighter. The mood shifted like the sky changing between clouds. Still overcast, but with sudden breaks of warmth. Preston's posture changed with it. His shoulders, which had been hunched forward, opened. His spine straightened. His breathing became audible in the silence of the hall, steady, rhythmic, almost like a second instrument. The second movement is deceptive. It sounds simple, playful even. But buried inside it are passages that expose every weakness in a pianist's technique. Trills that require absolute independence between fingers. Runs that must be clean enough to sound effortless, but precise enough to stay in tempo. Preston played them like he was having a conversation. Not with the audience, not with Gerald, with someone only he could see. A trill passage in the middle section came and went so cleanly it sounded like a single sustained note. Nora Sinclair, standing against the side wall, put her hand over her mouth and kept it there. In the front row, Vivian Holt opened her notebook. She uncapped her pen. She began writing. She did not stop writing for the next 6 minutes. Gerald took a half step backward. A small movement. Instinctive. The kind of step a man takes when he realizes the ground beneath him is not as solid as he thought. His face was still composed, but his hands had curled into loose fists at his sides. Not anger, something worse. Recognition. The second movement ended. The last note hung in the air for a breath. Then silence. And here, right here, something happened that no one in that hall, would ever forget. Preston lifted his hands from the keys. He placed them flat on his thighs, palms down, fingers still. He closed his eyes. He didn't move. 1 second passed. 2 seconds. 3. The hall was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents in the ceiling. Someone in the 8th row shifted in their seat, and the creak of the chair sounded like a thunderclap. A child in the back tugged on her mother's sleeve. The mother didn't respond. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked on the boy at the piano. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Nobody breathed. Because every person in that room understood, on some level they couldn't explain, that what had just happened was the calm, and what was coming next was the storm. Preston opened his eyes. He lifted his hands. He held them above the keys for one final second, fingers curved, wrists still, like a diver standing at the edge of a cliff. And he began the third movement. Presto agitato. The first chord hit the room like a fist. It was so sudden, so violent in its energy after the stillness of the last 3 seconds, that a woman in the 5th row physically flinched. Her husband grabbed her arm. A student backstage dropped his sheet music. The pages scattered across the floor. He didn't bend down. A wine glass somewhere near the back clinked against a chair. No one turned to look. Preston's hands became something else entirely. They moved across the keys with a speed and precision that didn't belong to a 15-year-old boy in a borrowed shirt. The left hand drove forward in relentless arpeggios, climbing, falling, climbing again, while the right hand hammered out the melody like it was trying to break through a wall. The Steinway responded. The sound was enormous. It filled every corner of the hall, bounced off the chandeliers, vibrated through the floor into the soles of people's shoes. You didn't just hear it. You felt it in your chest. You felt it behind your eyes. Gerald Thornton's face went white. Not slowly, not gradually, in an instant, like someone had pulled a plug and drained the color from his skin. His mouth opened slightly. His arms hung at his sides. His hands, the hands that had spent 22 years conducting, correcting, gatekeeping, were completely still. He looked like a man watching his own house burn down. Preston played faster. The ascending runs in the middle section, passages that most conservatory students simplify because they're too difficult at full tempo, Preston played as written, every note, full speed, clean as glass. His left hand crossed over his right in a passage that requires the kind of hand independence most pianists spend a decade developing. He didn't hesitate. He didn't fumble. He played it like it was the easiest thing he'd ever done. But it wasn't technique that broke the room open. Technique is impressive. What Preston did was something else. He was playing the grief, the years of silence, the keyboard with 3 dead keys, the midnight practices with headphones on, volume low, imagining notes that never made a sound. The father who died on a Tuesday night in November. The scholarship kid who ate lunch alone. The boy who sat in the back row of a music class, taught by a man who told him he had no pedigree. Every single note carried weight. Not just musical weight, human weight. The weight of being unseen. And now, for the first time in his life, being seen by everyone in the room at once. The crescendo began. Beethoven wrote the final section of the third movement as an escalation, arpeggios that climb higher and higher, louder and louder, until the tension becomes almost unbearable. It's the musical equivalent of a scream that has been held in for years, finally being released. Preston leaned into the piano, his body bent forward over the keys like a man praying. His foot worked the sustain pedal, not sloppily, not dramatically, but with surgical precision, holding exactly the right notes and releasing at exactly the right moment. Every phrase breathed. Every silence between the notes said as much as the notes themselves. The sound built and built and built. A man in the third row gripped both armrests of his chair. A teacher near the back door pressed her back flat against the wall. A student in the front row had tears running down his face and didn't seem to know it. A woman 2 seats from the aisle pressed her fist against her chest like the music was physically hitting her there. Higher, louder, faster. Preston's fingers hit the final ascending run, 16 notes in less than 2 seconds, and every single one was perfect. Not almost perfect, not impressive for his age perfect. Perfect. The final chord. Both hands came down. The sound exploded from the Steinway like something that had been locked inside it for years and was only now being set free. It filled the hall. It rattled the chandelier crystals. It hit the back wall and came back like an echo that didn't want to stop. Preston held the chord. His foot kept the sustain pedal down. The sound rang out. 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4. And then, slowly, he lifted his hands. His fingers left the keys. His foot released the pedal. And the hall went absolutely silent. Not polite silence. Not waiting to clap silence. The silence of 300 people who had just realized they had been completely, fundamentally, unforgivably wrong about the boy sitting at that piano. Preston's hands rested on his thighs. His chest rose and fell. A single bead of sweat rolled from his temple down to his jaw and dropped onto the piano bench. He was still looking at the keys. 1 second of silence. That's all it lasted. But it felt like a year. Then Vivian Holt stood up. She didn't clap first. She just stood. Notebook still in her hand. Pen still uncapped. She looked at Preston the way a jeweler looks at a diamond that just came out of a river. Disbelief and certainty fighting each other across her face. Then she clapped. Once. Twice. Slow and deliberate. Nora Sinclair was next. She pushed off the wall where she had been standing, and she stood straight, and she clapped so hard her palms turned red within seconds. Then the student in the front row, the one with tears still wet on his cheeks, stood. Then the woman beside him. Then the man behind her. Then an entire row. Then 2 rows. Then 5. It moved through the hall like a wave. Not the polite, measured applause that had followed every student performance that evening. This was different. This was raw, unplanned. The sound of 300 people discovering at the same moment that they had witnessed something they would talk about for the rest of their lives. A mother in the second row was openly sobbing. She wasn't embarrassed about it. A father near the aisle stood with his hands above his head, clapping so hard his watch slipped down his wrist. A student backstage, the boy who had dropped his sheet music during the third movement, walked out from behind the curtain, program forgotten, and just stared. The ovation grew louder and louder. Someone near the back shouted, not a word, just a sound, the kind of sound that comes out of a person when admiration overwhelms vocabulary. And then there was Gerald Thornton. He hadn't moved, not 1 inch. He stood exactly where he had been standing when Preston sat down, stage left, 3 feet from the piano. But everything about him had changed. His face was the color of old paper. His mouth was open slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes. The eyes that had spent 22 years deciding who deserved to make music were blinking rapidly, like a man trying to wake up from something. His hands hung at his sides. Empty. Useless. The applause kept going. 15 seconds. 20. 30. It didn't slow down. It got louder. People who had already been clapping started clapping harder. A few began stamping their feet against the hardwood floor. The chandeliers trembled. Gerald tried to recover. He took a step forward. He opened his mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to claim some piece of this moment, maybe to say something that would put the evening back into the shape he had planned. But Headmaster Ashford was already on his feet, already moving toward the stage. And every pair of eyes that had been on Gerald all evening, the parents, the donors, the Curtis Institute representative, had shifted. They weren't looking at Gerald anymore. Nobody was looking at Gerald anymore. And that, more than the music, more than the applause, more than the 300 people on their feet, was what broke him. Not anger, not shame, irrelevance. The sudden, crashing realization that he had spent 22 years building an authority that a 15-year-old boy had just made meaningless in 11 minutes. Gerald's chin dropped. His shoulders curved inward. He took a step back, then another. He moved into the shadow at the edge of the stage like a man trying to leave his own body. The applause finally began to fade. Preston stood from the bench. Slowly. He turned to face the audience for the first time. His eyes were dry. His face was calm. Not proud, not gloating, just calm. The calm of a boy who had finally said the thing he had been holding inside for years. He looked at Gerald, standing in the shadow, smaller than he had ever been. Preston said, quietly, clearly, with no anger and no apology, "You wanted a tune. I hope that was enough." He turned and walked off the stage. Gerald didn't follow. He couldn't. His legs wouldn't move. Preston made it halfway down the corridor before his legs started shaking. He leaned against the wall, cool tile against his back, and pressed both palms flat against his thighs to stop the trembling. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. The adrenaline that had carried him through 11 minutes of Beethoven was draining out of his body all at once. And what was left behind was a 15-year-old kid standing alone in a hallway, trying not to fall down. The applause was still echoing from the recital hall, muffled now, but steady, like a heartbeat on the other side of a wall. Footsteps, quick, heels on hardwood. Nora Sinclair came around the corner. She was walking fast, almost running, and when she saw Preston against the wall, she stopped. Her eyes were red. Her hands were still shaking from clapping. She didn't say anything dramatic. She didn't give a speech. She looked at him and asked one question. "How long?" Preston blinked. "How long what? How long have you been able to play like that?" Preston thought about it, about the keyboard on the living room floor, about the headphones at midnight, about the 3 dead keys and the notes he had to imagine. "Since I was 7, Nora exhaled. She pressed her fingers against her forehead and shook her head slowly. Not disappointment, something closer to grief. The grief of realizing that extraordinary things can live inside people for years without anyone bothering to look. 8 years, she said quietly. 8 years, and nobody knew. Nobody asked. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. There was nothing else to say about that. More footsteps, slower this time, measured. The click of expensive shoes. Vivian Holt appeared at the end of the corridor. She walked toward Preston with a kind of calm that comes from decades of being in rooms where important things happen. Her notebook was closed now, tucked under her arm. Her pen was back in her jacket pocket. She stopped in front of Preston and extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and warm. "My name is Vivian Holt. I'm the Director of Community Outreach at the Curtis Institute of Music." Preston nodded. He knew what Curtis was. Every serious pianist in Philadelphia knew what Curtis was. It was the place you dreamed about and never said out loud, because saying it out loud would make it real, and real things can be taken away. Vivian didn't offer flattery. She didn't tell him he was amazing or gifted or special. She spoke to him the way she would speak to a colleague. Your dynamic control in the third movement was exceptional. The tempo shifts were clean. Your pedal work is advanced beyond your age by several years. She paused. I'd like to discuss a full scholarship audition, if you're interested. Preston looked at the business card she held out. Thick paper, embossed letters. The kind of card that opens doors that don't have handles on the outside. He took it. His hand was still trembling. He put the card in his shirt pocket, the pocket right above his heart, and said, "Yes, ma'am, I'm interested." Vivian smiled. Small. Real. Good. I'll be in touch with your family. She turned and walked back toward the recital hall. Her heels echoed until they faded. The following Monday morning, Headmaster Ashford called Gerald Thornton into his office. The door was closed for 45 minutes. No one heard exactly what was said, but students passing in the hallway heard Ashford's voice, raised, sharp, nothing like the polished greeting he used at donor events. Gerald walked out of that office looking 10 years older. His cashmere coat hung on his shoulders like it didn't fit anymore. By the end of the month, he was reassigned, no longer teaching performance classes, no longer running the spring recital, no longer deciding who had the pedigree to touch a piano. He wasn't fired. He wasn't publicly shamed. He was simply moved out of the way of something bigger than him. And somehow, that was worse. That night, the night of the recital, Preston went home. He sat at the kitchen table across from Diane. The house was quiet. The faucet dripped its familiar rhythm. He pulled Vivian Holt's card from his shirt pocket and placed it on the table between them. Diane picked it up, read it again. Then she set it down, very carefully, like it was made of glass. She didn't scream. She didn't jump up. She didn't cry. Not yet. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Preston's hand. Her palm was warm and rough and steady. The hand that had raised him, fed him, held him together on the nights when the empty chair at the table felt too heavy to sit near. She said 5 words. "Your daddy's smiling somewhere." And then Preston cried. Not the way he cried when he was 6 and didn't understand the word instant. This was different. This was the cry of a boy who had carried something enormous inside him for 8 years and had finally set it down. Diane held his hand and let him. The faucet dripped. The kitchen was warm. And for the first time in a very long time, the row house on 54th Street didn't feel small. 2 weeks later, Preston went to Louise Calloway's house. He sat down at the old upright piano, the one with the chipped keys and the slightly flat B natural, and he played the Moonlight Sonata again. Just the first movement, slowly, softly, the way it was meant to be played, when no one is judging, and no one needs convincing. Louise sat in her chair by the window, eyes closed, hands folded in her lap, the fingers that couldn't reach an octave anymore, but could still hear every note that mattered. When Preston finished, the room was quiet. Not the silence of 300 strangers, the silence of 2 people who understand each other completely. Louise opened her eyes. Now you played it for yourself. That's the one that counts. Preston smiled. Small. Real. The same kind of smile Vivian Holt had given him in the corridor. He started classes at the Curtis Institute that fall. Full scholarship. The youngest student admitted that year. He didn't quit Whitfield Academy. Not right away. He stayed through the end of the semester. Not because he had to, but because Nora Sinclair asked him something he couldn't say no to. We're starting an after-school music program for students on financial aid. Would you help? He said yes. So twice a week, in the same recital hall where Gerald Thornton had tried to break him, Preston Everett sat at the same Steinway grand piano and taught kids who looked like him how to play. Kids who couldn't afford lessons. Kids who had keyboards with dead keys. Kids who hummed Chopin while doing homework and didn't know that was extraordinary. He taught them the way Louise taught him, with patience, with silence, with the belief that talent doesn't need permission. If this story moves something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because every week we bring you another story about someone the world counted out, and the moment they counted themselves back in. Next week, a dishwasher at a Michelin star restaurant who was told he'd never touch a stove, until the head chef collapsed during service. One last question, and I want you to think about it before you scroll. Have you ever watched someone get underestimated and then quietly prove every person in the room wrong? What happened? Tell us in the comments.
You know what I learned from this story? The people who try hardest to put you down are the ones who are the most afraid of what you can do. Think about that. If you were really nothing, if you really didn't matter, why would they waste their time trying to stop you? They wouldn't. They come after you because they see something. They just don't want you to see it too. And here's the other thing. You don't need anyone's permission to be great. Not a teacher, not a boss, not anyone's. You practice, you work, you prove in the dark, in the quiet, when somebody's watching, and when the moment comes. And it will come. You will be ready. Not because someone believes in you, not because you believed in you first. But I need to say this too. If you are a person who sees someone struggling alone, open the door. That's it. You don't need to be rich. You don't need to be powerful. Just open the door. Say, let's see what you got. You have no idea how much it means to someone who's been invisible in their whole lives. So, let me ask you, has anyone ever told you that you couldn't do something? And did you prove that wrong? Tell me in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe. Real stories, real justice, every week. And remember, the people who doubt you the loudest are the ones who fear you the most.